Good morning. I want to begin by thanking Bernie Poppy for inviting me to preach here this morning, a place which has great meaning and merit for me. I was rector here for 14 years at All Saints Church, and the church is empty at this moment, but in some measure it's filled with the memories, the relationships, the spirit that is so much a part of this place, and I'm grateful for that. May the words of my mouth, the meditation of all our hearts, be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The book of Genesis, from which the first lesson is taken this morning, is in large measure a long case file of an extended family. It tells the story of this family over several generations. It's not a confidential case file. We've had access to it for thousands of years. We've been reading from it and learning with it. And part of the case file, the good news of the case file, is it doesn't redact the reality of this family story. It doesn't airbrush out the greed, the deceit, the betrayal, all the dysfunction that this family carried. This morning we hear the story of a new generation, two twins born to Rebecca and Isaac. Rebecca's been barren for a long time, so she's excited. She doesn't know that she's going to have twins, but she does know that her pregnancy is difficult. There is turmoil inside of her. The Lord comes to her and says, "What you will give birth to will be division." Not a very comforting message. And so the boys are born. Esau comes out first, which means he's the primogenitor. He will inherit eventually the full wealth of the family. Close on his heels, literally grabbing a hold of his heel, is Jacob the younger, who will inherit nothing. We can imagine that the struggle in the womb continued through their youth as they were very different people. Esau liked to be outdoors hunting. Jacob liked to be in the tent spending time with his mother. When they were adults, the story goes on. The story goes on that Esau comes back from hunting. And he's famished, he says, and he points to the edge of the tent and sees some food and says, "Give me some of that red stuff." And Jacob says to his brother, Sure, I will give it to you, provided you sell me your birthright." Esau's rather impulsive, and he can only see as far as his next meal, and he says, "Sure, you can have my birthright, just give me some of that red stuff." So he sells his birthright for a piece of bread and some lentil stew. And Jacob is now the older son. Not officially, he has to go to his father, who is blind and doesn't know much in the fog of his old age. And Jacob goes to his father and puts his hand out covered with animal hair and says, "Please bless me." And Isaac blesses Jacob, figuring that it's Esau, but it's not, it's Jacob. And it's now official. It's now official. Jacob is the inheritor of the family wealth, the family legacy. That story continues. Continues in the modern way recently, because we as a people, white Europeans, have stolen the freedom of Africans, bringing them over here to this land to be enslaved for 250 years. The freedom now has been accorded to people who had previously been enslaved, but the cultural mindset is still that we own, white Europeans own their birthright, and treat them with disrespect over and over again. Not only did we steal the freedom of a whole tribe of people, we stole the land of the people who were already here. And there are those who look at the American case files and either want to redact it, dismantle it, or ignore it, but that is where it is. The story continues with Jacob and Esau. Esau realized that he's been snookered by his brother, and he's furious, and he wants revenge. And Rachel, who is Jacob's mother and who favors Jacob, warns Jacob and says, you need to leave. You can go to my brother's place in a distant land. And Jacob steals off, and for decades he's removed from his original family. And he assembles his own family. In the course of time, he is snookered by his father-in-law, and he also cheats out his brothers-in-law of their wealth. This is a very thick case file. Things reach a critical point later on. A critical point later on when Jacob somewhat comes to himself and wants to atone for the deceit he's visited upon his brother. And he says, message to Esau that he wants a family meeting. The message comes back to Jacob, yes, let's have the family meeting. And Jacob is terrified. He's terrified, figuring that Esau will exact revenge on not just Jacob, but his whole family. And so Jacob amasses his living wealth, his cattle, his camels, his goats, his sheep, and sends them out in waves to meet Esau, figuring that he can buy his brother off. And it seems to work, and then Jacob sees Esau coming with 400 men, and he's scared out of his mind. The story continues, the family meeting happens, and instead of revenge, Esau comes to his brother, falls on his neck, kisses him, and there is reconciliation. We might like to think that they lived happily ever after. Well, it's not quite the case. There was indeed reconciliation, but they had to work at it to enable it to endure. Buried within this case file is a short snippet of a night that Jacob spends alone, the night before he meets his brother after all those years. He's alone on one side of the Jabbok River. He sent his family over to the other side. He's alone there, except in the middle of the night a man comes. Or is it an angel? Or is it God? And they wrestle all night long. All night long, and at daybreak it becomes clear that Jacob is going to prevail. Yet, his hip is placed out of joint through the struggle, and he's left with a limp not just for that moment, but for the rest of his life. And as the wrestling ends, Jacob says to this man, or is it an angel, or is it God, you need to bless me. And this other person, angel, God, blesses Jacob. The story continues, because especially in the past month or so, we have been wrestling with racism and prejudice. Ever since the death of George Floyd, one of the hopeful signs is we're hearing more stories. More stories from people who've been victimized, who've been demeaned, diminished, destroyed, denied. People are getting bolder in telling their stories. More stories are being told, and people are listening to those stories. And their hearts and their minds are changing as a result of these stories. It calls to mind an experience I had nearly 30 years ago when I was rector of an urban church in New Jersey. It was right after the Rodney King fiasco, when Rodney King was arrested in Los Angeles. A black man pulled out of his car and beaten to a pulp by white police officers, and they were cleared of any wrongdoing, which set off riots and rage throughout the country. There was tension in the country, in the community, and certainly in the congregation. We decided we're going to have a forum. So we had a forum after church held in church. And we began to discuss our feelings and our thoughts and what it is we should do as a Christian community in response. And at first, people were careful and guarded, all of which reflected kind of a resistance to go any deeper. But everything changed. The mood changed. When one of the wardens stood up, Jamaican woman, dentist mother, stood up and in tears expressed her fear for her then 7-year-old son. She said, "I'm worried that when he becomes 16, 17 and can be in a car, he will be pulled out and he will be beaten. He might even be killed. I'm scared of that." Her witness was real and it was raw. And for many of the white people in that forum, they were able to move from thinking about this issue as something they read about in the newspaper or heard about on the news, and now they heard the story of fear told by a woman that they trusted and respected. And in that moment, I could see that people were becoming woke to the reality of our past, which extends into the present. How people's freedom has been stolen and denied and victimized. In the gospel this morning, Jesus tells a story. A sower goes out to sows seeds on rocky ground, on a path, in thorns, and on fertile ground. As you might expect, there are different outcomes, from nothing growing on the rocky path to 50 to 100-fold growth in the good soil. I would submit to you that among the many seeds that Jesus sowed and continues to sow are the seeds of racial justice. And some of those seeds fall on rocky soil among people who say, "Well, we've been through this. That story is done. Get over it. I don't want to hear about it anymore. I don't want to change anything." And some of the seeds fall on the path. And people hear the stories and see the witness, and their hearts are lifted for a moment, and they say, "Black lives matter." But in the next moment, they say, "Blue lives matter." And then they say, "All lives matter." So the Black Lives Matter shoots get crowded out and die. And some seeds of racial justice are sown among the thorns of COVID pandemic and economic fragility, and people aren't able to see because of all the other things that are constricting, if not crippling. And then some seeds are sown among good soil, and there's great abundance, and there's flourishing. Over these past months, as the weather has gotten warmer, I have spent a lot of time in our garden in New Hampshire, and it is in good soil. It's been mulched, and soil amendments have been added, and a lot of time is taken, and it is flourishing. And then there's the weeding. I need to weed. When I don't want to weed, I need to weed. And I wrestle with the weeds. I wrestle with the weeds as we, as a culture, we wrestle with racism. We wrestle with it. How does it affect us? And there are those of us who say, "Well, I don't know about racism," but from the Jacob and Esau story, we learn that Jacob had a limp as a result of his wrestling. We, you and I, all of us have a limp as a result of the wrestling with racism. There are some who will say, "I don't have a limp," or "I had a limp once and I don't have it anymore." If you think that you don't have a limp, think again. All of us learned If not about racism, then certainly about prejudice. And where did we learn it? At the kitchen table or in the cafeteria, on the playground, or in church, or a misreading of the Bible. We learned it somewhere. That some of us have a birthright that is more valuable and more important than someone else. There are genealogists who say that this prejudice has been bred into us. It is the virus of original sin. And the challenge for us, as it was for Jacob, is to acknowledge our limp as we continue to wrestle. That we have this limp, we have this wound which we carry with us. We can't deny it. We can't put it on the shelf. It won't go away. And the challenge is to know how it got there, how it works, and what we can do about it. We have to work at it, to engage in reconciliation, if not reparation. The reparation will involve a lot more than camels, goats, and sheep. Acknowledge the limp, the wound, this virus of original sin called prejudice and racism. We need to meet that. We need to acknowledge that. At the same time, we need to meet and acknowledge and celebrate the blessing of life. There are a lot of blessings in the case files of the Jacob-Esau family story. Lots of blessings. Jesus continues to offer his blessing to us even today. We need to acknowledge those blessings, how they help us with our limp, how they help heal and reconcile the world. That we as ministers, you and I, not just the ordained, all of us, have been commissioned to be bearers of the blessing, to be bearers of the blessing to a world that desperately needs it. May it be so.